Hello, everybody in the VC and the rest of YouTube. It's Matt, and I'm back with another review series, and this time it's for a band. I had finished up here 2 or 3 weeks ago with I did all the solo Beatle album reviews in order of release for each of the four guys there, and was torn between doing this band and doing a particular solo artist. I decided to go with the band to do the solo artist in time, God willing. That band is the Rolling Stones. So, the reason I picked them, I figured I'd just go back to the beginning because the Beatles were my first and biggest love in music, or the first band that I really went ape over. The Rolling Stones were the second band that I did that for. And with the Beatles, it was probably when I was like 8 or 9. I knew about them before that when I was younger, but didn't have anything for them or against them. Just didn't really pay much attention to them. They were just sort of music on the radio that I was aware of, certain songs, and kind of knew who they were. Had a vague idea that they'd broken up. Same with the Rolling Stones. I had this vague idea of who they were. I always known the song Satisfaction, I guess, practically all my life. I don't remember when it came out because I was born in 1963 and it came out in 65 summer, I think. So I was probably like a year and a half old. Obviously don't remember that. I do remember vague memories of Paint It Black when that was new. I remember that being on the radio, and I remember that I liked the song. Probably had absolutely no idea what it meant, but just liked the sound of it, the music of it. And I remember Honky Tonk Woman because that was a big hit, and that would have been when I was 5 or 6 years old. So when I got in the Beatles, and of course I was a kid, so whatever money I could get out of allowance or just cajole out of my parents or grandparents or however I could get money here and there, started collecting the Beatle albums and the solo Beatle albums. And at the time, I was thought, well, I should probably check into the Rolling Stones because I know they're contemporaries of the Beatles, and I knew that they were still going where the Beatles were broken up, but they were of the 60s and the same era as the Beatles. And so finally, in, I want to say, probably late 76, early 77, a friend of mine in school, Brian, I don't remember what conversation brought up the Rolling Stones, but for some reason it got mentioned, and he told me that he has a Rolling Stones record that he doesn't really want. If I want it, he'd give it to me. And said someone gave it to his brother, and he didn't like it. His brother gave it to him. He didn't like it, so he'll give it to me. And I thought, well, it's free, why not? So said yeah, and then a day or two later, Brian brings a copy of Black and Blue, the Black and Blue album, to school and gives it to me. And I'm looking at the cover and all, I'm looking at the song listing, and I don't recognize any of these songs. And so I take the album home and play it, and I was very underwhelmed, to say the least. In fact, I thought, this is kind of shit. And this doesn't sound anything like Honky Tonk Woman or Satisfaction or Jumpin' Jack Flash or the few Rolling Stone songs I was aware of. And that kind of dampened my interest in checking out more Rolling Stones or getting to know more about them. And at this point, I think I knew who Mick Jagger was and probably heard the name Brian Jones, and didn't know the names of the rest of them, and just knew a handful of songs that kind of were the big hits that everybody knows. And they're from England, and they're around when the Beatles were around, and they're still around, and that's pretty much all I knew about them. But Black and Blue did not leave me enamored, to say the least. So sometime later, I don't know, a few months, maybe a year later, whatever, turn on the radio and they play, the DJ plays Ruby Tuesday, which just knocked my socks off and threw me for a loop and just floored me. Just a wonderful, beautiful song, which I had never heard before, as far as I know. I mean, I probably did because it was a number one hit, but again, it was a number one hit when I was 3 or 4 years old, so probably just wasn't aware of it. But but I just loved it, and I said, man, I've got to remember the name of that song, and I did, and I went to a record store downtown Fort Worth, which is no longer there, and looked around, and I found the 45 Ruby Tuesday. So I said, get this, and I took it home, played it over and over. At some point, I looked on the back side, the flip side, and there's this song called "Let's Spend the Night Together." I know what this is. Played that, and that just like Ruby Tuesday, just floored me, just knocked me out, and so some way, somehow, because I'm at this point probably 13 or so, I got the money, or bothered my parents until they finally bought it for me to shut me up. Got a copy of Hot Rocks, the greatest hits album that has the great cover and the gatefold and the cool picture on the back of the Stones from this old castle, and all these great Rolling Stones. One of the best greatest hits albums ever, in my opinion. And so all these great Rolling Stones songs from 64 to 71. And then I learned that there was a new Rolling Stones album to come out, which didn't really excite me because Black and Blue was their latest album. There was a live album in between the two, Love You Live, but Black and Blue was their last studio album. So I was thinking, well, if it's anything like that, I don't know that I really care. But the radio started playing Miss You, which I loved, and then Beast of Burden, which I loved, and so eventually I got the Some Girls album. It's a great album, and from there I started buying as I could, because again, I'm still a kid. When I got the money, I started buying Rolling Stones albums, starting with their old 60s things, and so that's sort of my boring Rolling Stone story. If you want to know more about the band, how they came together and so forth, there's a ton of books. I don't think the definitive book has been, as far as I know, has not been written on the Rolling Stones yet. I don't think there's anything on par with like Tune In, the Beatles, the great book on the Beatles. But this is probably about the closest, The True Adventures of the Rolling Stones by Stanley Booth. This book came out in 83, 84. This is actually the copy that I bought back in 84, whenever it came out. And it's come out over a couple of different titles. It's still in print, so just remember Stanley Booth. And this goes up through about 69 or 70. Stanley Booth, that is, followed them on their 69 tour, so the book focuses on that and on the Altamont Tragedy Festival, however you want to call it. But it also has quite a bit of the background, how they got together and became a band in their early days and so forth. So it's a really good book, and even if you don't like the Rolling Stones, this is a good book to read. It's just a good picture of the 60s that just happens to have a lot of Rolling Stones stuff in it. So really good read. And there's a ton of other books on the Stones too. Or you can always go to the always reliable internet, because if anything on there, if it's on there, it's got to be true. So you can find out about the history of the Rolling Stones there. So what else? The 60s, it was are you a Beatles or a Stones fan? And they were pitted against each other, at least from a publicity standpoint. Don't know how much I bought any of that because Mick Jagger, the idea of Mick Jagger as a tough guy is kind of hard to buy there, and certainly not compared to like Lennon and Harrison. And but the Rolling Stones were in some ways sort of a flip side of the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles were no choir boys by any stretch of the imagination, but musically they were a bit more raw and earthy and bluesy, because the Beatles, the Rolling Stones were kids who liked rock and roll stuff, but they also liked a lot of the blues stuff that the Beatles liked, some of that stuff, but some of that stuff I don't think that they really knew about until later, so it didn't influence them early on like it did Keith and Brian Jones and Mick. And so you do get they're no not as good as the Beatles by any stretch of the imagination. You know, the Beatles blow them away as far as singers and songwriters and artists, but the Rolling Stones aren't too far behind. And so when I got in the Rolling Stones, already in the Beatles, like I said, that was my favorite bands, the Rolling Stones and the Beatles. It's funny, I've got a friend of mine who I grew up with, and it's the opposite for him. His favorite band is the Rolling Stones, and second is the Beatles. And that's the way it was for a while until a few years later I got into the Who and the Kinks, and new wave and punk happened and all. But even with that, I've always loved the Rolling Stones and still do to this day. And they would be, if I was ranking my favorite bands, they would be in the top 4, 5 at the most, but probably in the top 4. So, as far as the other reviews I've done on Beach Boys, the solo Beatles, and Kinks, and whoever else I've done all the albums in order of release and the complete discography. I don't know I'm going to do that with the Rolling Stones simply because once you get to the mid 80s, musically I kind of lost interest in them and stopped buying their albums. A lot of the albums from the late 80s and 90s, some of them I had, all of them I've heard. I don't have any of them anymore. I didn't really like them, and I don't know that I want to go out and buy the albums that I haven't had for 20 years and listen to them again. Excuse me, but I might, because it could be interesting to give them a fresh listen and see if my opinion's changed any on those albums. We'll see, but we've got a lot of albums to get through before we get to that point, and I'll figure it out. I'm just saying that I may stop, early 80s with the Stones instead of going all the way through, because even though I still love their music, their old music, they basically just oldies Vegas review live act these days, I think, but they can still surprise. Their latest single, I guess, the what's the title? It's like living in a ghost town, or living in a ghost town, or like a ghost town. Really good song, and that surprised me. I wasn't expecting anything good because I don't think they've really done anything that good for nearly 40 years, but that was a great song, I thought, and summed up 2020 really well. I'm surprised it wasn't more of a hit and didn't get more play, but that's way down the line. So what else I guess that's about it. So we'll get to the first album here, and they had several 45s before they released the album. I think they had 2 45s and an EP. Unlike the Beatles, who released 45 songs that they wrote, the Rolling Stones, I believe their first 6 45s were all covers. There were some originals on the flip sides, I believe, but the first 45 was Come On, cover of a Chuck Berry song, which with Chuck Berry's version is a great rocker. The Rolling Stones version, which is quaint, and I do kind of like it, and we'll get to that because it's not on this album, but it's a little too frenetic and too fast-paced, and not in a good way, and just kind of a cartoonish cover. The band didn't really like it either. And their second 45 was I Want to Be Your Man, Lennon McCartney song that the Beatles wrote for them. And of course, the Beatles did a version with Ringo singing it, which was a pretty good version. I think it's pretty close. I like both, that Stones version, and I like the Beatles version. And I may even give the Stones version just as a little grittier, a little bit of an edge. But it's kind of funny that the Beatles, from the first 45 out, were already writing music and the Rolling Stones weren't. And it took some time for them to get their songwriting legs, where the Beatles, and the Beatles' first album had a lot of cover songs too, but it had a fair amount of originals and some really good stuff. And the Beatles developed a lot quicker as songwriters than the Rolling Stones. And part of the reason that the Rolling Stones started writing songs to begin with, I think, is that their manager, Andrew Loog Oldham, told them that, you're going to have to start writing songs if you want hits, because you can't just be covering old blues songs and expect to keep the public going to get bored with that pretty quick. Even though they did They're one of the few white musicians who did a good job of singing the blues. Not that anybody was ever going to mistake the Rolling Stones for Big Bill Broonzy or Robert Johnson or Muddy Waters or anything, but they did a lot better than most white singers or bands who tried to do the blues. And because I think their heart was in it, and I think they really loved the music, and even though they, like I said, you're not going to mistake them for Muddy Waters, their love of the music really shone through in those early covers. And so, anyway, their first album, and this is the British version, which is just called The Rolling Stones. In America, it was called England's Newest Hitmakers, The Rolling Stones. Had the same cover, but it had the title, and this was kind of unheard of because this is a 1964 album. It's just a picture of the band with no title, the band's name's not on there. You have to go to the back to see the band's name. It's a mono copy. There's all your players. You got Mick and Brian and Bill and Charlie and Keith. And I think it's kind of funny because it says Mick is vocals and harmonica, Brian Jones is guitar, harmonica, and vocals, Bill Wyman is bass guitar and vocals, and then you get down to Keith Richards, it just says guitar. It's like, they ain't gonna let that guy sing. Not at that time anyway. Eventually he would, but but yeah, kind of a revolution, just like the Beatles. With the Beatles, with the half-lit shadow faces, was pretty revolutionary for album cover artwork. This was too with the Rolling Stones, because I missed a good picture of the band there. And outside of the 60s, the Rolling Stones really didn't have very good album covers, I don't think, but during the 60s they had some pretty good ones. And this is a good cover, just a good picture of the band, but just this might be the first album to not have the title of the album with the band's name on it. I don't know, maybe some country or jazz album or classical thing before that, but as far as rock and roll, I could be wrong, but I think this might be the first one to do that. So here is it's a mono copy, not original unfortunately, but mono all the same. So this album came out April 16th, 1964 in England. Came out May 30th, 64 in the United States. It got to number one in England and stayed there for quite a while. In fact, I think it is the album that with the Beatles had been number one forever and finally slipped to number two, and this one became number one right after With the Beatles. In America, for their first album, because they really weren't that well known in America till the last time, but really Satisfaction in 65. They were known, but they weren't a major band. Probably in 64, of course, the Beatles, but the Animals, the Kinks, I don't know when Herman's Hermits made their first records, but quite a few of those British bands were bigger and more known than the Rolling Stones. The Rolling Stones did their first tour, maybe their first couple of tours in America, and just played these smaller places and had half full halls and did okay, but not great. It wasn't the conquering success that the Beatles had when they came over for the first time. It was nothing like that. They would get there, but it would take a little longer. But that said, the album, which is of course called England's Newest Hitmakers, in America it did get to number 11, so it's not so bad for a first time out with a brand new band, pretty much unknown band. So number 11 in America, and oddly it was, to this day I believe it's the only Rolling Stones American studio album that didn't make the top 5. So kind of interesting, but it's their first release, so kind of understandable. The same thing with the Beatles, where you had the British and American Beatle albums were different track listings, and then you had some of the Capitol would do things like Yesterday and Today and Something New. They'd kind of cobble together, leave tracks off the British album and 45s and cobble together American albums that didn't exist in Britain, like Something New and Yesterday and Today and Beatles' second album, stuff like that. Same thing with the Rolling Stones, which actually the same thing happened with the Who and the Yardbirds and the Kinks, and that was just sort of common until about 67 or so, when Sgt. Pepper on out, all the Beatles albums were the same in America and England. Pretty much that was the case too with the Rolling Stones and most of the other bands. So there's not a whole lot of difference between the American and British album of this. This one, the U.S. version has Not Fade Away, a cover of the old Buddy Holly song, in place of Mona, I Need You Baby, which is on this album and not on the American album, and that's really the only difference. This is, as far as a debut album, this is up there. This is really, if I was doing my top 10 Rolling Stone albums, this would probably be down around number 9 or 10, but it'd probably be in that top 10 list. I really love this album, and as a debut, it's a good one. It's not quite as good as the Beatles' debut. It's actually better than the Kinks' debut, because the Kinks, in my opinion, are a better band than the Rolling Stones. But I do love the Rolling Stones, but I'd put the Kinks at number 2 behind the Beatles. The Kinks album, of course, has You Really Got Me and Stop Your Sobbing, and there's nothing of that level on this Rolling Stones album. But this is a good, strong album, and it's really good. The funny thing about it is it's all covers with the exception of 3 originals, and 2 of them are Nanker Felge cuts, which was a pseudonym for just songs written credited to the whole band. And there's 1 Jagger Richards original on here. So at this point, right up to this point, Brian Jones was kind of the de facto leader of the band. That would change very quickly because Mick was the guy out front singing, and Mick and Keith started writing songs. Brian, from what I've read, tried and just never could write songs, and so his leadership, he's the guy that started the band, he's the guy that named the band, probably was the best musician for the first few years of the band until he got lost in drugs and other problems. But it quickly, Mick and Keith overtook him just because they were the songwriters and Mick was the front man, so which caused a lot of problems for Brian and the band. But at this point, they're all pretty much a cohesive unit, and so yeah, let's just go through the songs. Side 1 is Route 66, which was a Chuck Berry song, but it's also an old song from way back when that was done by Nat King Cole, Bing Crosby, the Andrews Sisters, and plenty of other people before Chuck Berry or the Rolling Stones, and probably plenty of people have covered it since those days. But I'd give Chuck Berry's the edge, but the Rolling Stones it's a really good opener to the album, upbeat and strong, kind of rock and roll opener. Keith Richards always had a lifelong love of Chuck Berry's music. It's one of his heroes, and so it's a good way to start the album. And I'm going to give the Rolling Stones Route 66 a 10. Next is I Just Want to Make Love to You. It's an old Willie Dixon written song that Muddy Waters released from back in 1954, I think was the Muddy Waters version. Etta James did a version of it too. This is just a good screaming Jagger vocal fronting a raucous, driving rock and roll music behind him, courtesy of the band. And I Just Want to Make Love to You a 10. Third song, Honest I Do, is a good slow tempo blues ballad. It's an old Jimmy Reed song originally. It's got a good harmonica and bluesy guitar. I'm thinking that's probably courtesy of Brian Jones. Jagger can't match Jimmy Reed. In fact, he kind of sounds like he's 12 years old at times here. Stupid thing throws. I hate when it does that. And this is kind of the bluesy stuff that a lot of that stuff probably seemed cliche. It does seem cliche now, but it probably didn't to British and American kids back in 1964. So, Honest I Do, Jimmy Reed version is better, yes, but I'm going to give the Rolling Stones version a 10 too. Next is Mona. There's a Bo Diddley song from 1957. Rolling Stones do a pretty good job at the Bo Diddley shuffle beat. Jagger's vocals kind of alternate here. That's one drawback because at times they seem really urgent, like he's delivering the song with heart. And at times his vocals seem kind of anemic throughout the song. So because of that, I'm going to give Mona, the Rolling Stones version, a 9. Next up is Can I Get a Witness? No, it's not. It's Now I've Got a Witness. Sorry. This is the first original on here. This is one of those that's credited to Nanker Felge, which they would have, like I said, that was just songs that were credited to the band. Most of those were instrumentals, not, there was a one or two with a vocal, but most were instrumental. That didn't last long. That didn't last much past 65 or so, the Nanker Felge credit. From there on out, it would be Jagger Richards on everything. But so that was written with the band and Gene Pitney and Phil Spector chiming in. It's an instrumental that sounds kind of like music you'd hear at a roller rink back in the 1950s, or a drive-up diner with car hop girls running around. But it's a little bluesier than that, only because of the harmonica, which I suspect is Brian again. It's got a swell guitar solo midway through, which probably also courtesy of Brian, might be Keith, I'm not sure. Nice bass line towards the end of the song. So that one gets a 7.5. It's a instrumental, sort of a throwaway filler, but it's a nice enough bit. And that's another good thing about this album, is that you can put it on and just listen to it from start to finish. And some of the songs are better than others, of course, but it's a good listen all the way through. Good little journey. Number 6 on side 1 is Little by Little, another Nanker Felge cut. Again, this time it has lyrics, which I don't know if the band all contributed to the lyrics or if it's just Mick and Keith. But I don't know. They're trying a little too hard to mimic their blues heroes with this song. They don't really have their songwriting legs quite yet. They'd get them pretty quick. So Little by Little is a little bit of a slight effort. Not terrible, but nothing to write home about. I'm going to give that one a 7.5. On side 2, excuse me, we open with I'm a King Bee. This is an old Slim Harpo song from 1951. And this is not as good as Slim Harpo's version, of course, but it is Jagger's first great vocal, I think. And it's got all that sort of affected, snotty, don't give a damn, we're better than you and we don't care attitude that the band would come to be known for and characterized for pretty quickly. And so I'm a King Bee is a really good one. I'm going to give that a 10. A lot of 10s on this album. I really like this album, if you couldn't tell already. Next is Carol, a Chuck Berry song. A lot better than their cover version of Come On. Not as good as Chuck Berry's version, but still pretty great. Great guitar riff, which I'm pretty sure is from Keith. Bass guitar and guitar interplay, the drums, everything about it. It's just a great rocker. So Carol gets a 10. Now we get the first Jagger Richards original, Tell Me, sometimes called Tell Me You're Coming Back. Great background singing, because I guess they were sort of trying to mimic the Beatles with the background vocals and stuff, something that they would sometimes do, but kind of get into their own Rolling Stones sound pretty quick. But Tell Me, it was released as a 45 in the US. It only got to number 24. I don't know if it was released as 45 in England. But they would write a lot better songs. This one is kind of their equal to say something like Love Me Do or P.S. I Love You or something by the Beatles, as far as just substance wise, not sound wise. But I always like Tell Me. It's a great one. I'm going to give that a 10. Next up is Can I Get a Witness, which was a Marvin Gaye song. Mick Jagger can't match Marvin Gaye vocal wise by any stretch of the imagination, but it's a bouncy, upbeat song, just like the Marvin song version is. I'm going to give Can I Give a Witness a 9. Yeah, go with the Marvin Gaye version, but the Rolling Stones version is pretty good too. Number 5, You Can Make It If You Try. This is a Gene Allison song from 1957. It's a good Jagger, because a bunch of this is sort of blues covers. Uh, I mean, you got the Chuck Berry stuff, you got the Motown, the Marvin Gaye thing, but here's a good Jagger in a soulful voice, kind of a country soul sounding ballad with just some good stuff. So I'm going to give that one a 9.5. You Can Make It By If You Try was also covered later by Sly and the Family Stone, which is, truth be told, better than the Rolling Stones version. It's just a great funk rave up. But I like the Rolling Stones version. I'm going to give it a 9.5. Last song on the album is Walking the Dog, a Rufus Thomas song, from Stax Records. Might be, well, I like pretty much every song on this album, but that might be my favorite song. Um, that or Tell Me or King Bee. But yeah, I like Walking the Dog. That gets a 10. It's just a great album closer. Just a kind of a soul and a rock song together in one package, and just sounds great. So I'm gonna give this album, and I don't know if that's still working or if my screen is frozen. Y'all can see any of that. I'm gonna give this album a 10. It's a good start for a good band. Like I said, they're not as good as the Beatles debut. Actually, better than the Kinks debut, but somewhere in between there. Just a great album, and one of my favorite Rolling Stones albums. And I think it's one that Mick Jagger actually has a fondness for. And anyway, so that is the Rolling Stones. And like I said, I'm going to try to navigate these early albums because there are certain albums that were released in England and the United States. There's certain that were only released in the U.S. and so it's kind of hard to, but we'll do the best we can on all that until they get to where the releases are the same on both sides of the pond. But trying to think of anything else. I've already talked forever here, and I can't really think of anything. If I think of stuff, we'll get to it in the upcoming reviews. So hope everyone's having a good October, and we will talk to you soon.